Hey everybody, today we're going to take a look at a quick tip for you on how to use flows to make your flying just a little bit safer.
AOPA keeps flying safe, accessible, and fun by protecting your freedom to fly. We are the most trusted one-stop resource for all things related to general aviation. Become an AOPA pilot today.
In 2010, NASA did an operational study where they observed 60 operational airline flights, and what they found was that over almost 900 missed items or other deviations happened during that flight. Now, luckily, nothing happened, mainly because of a technique that we're going to talk about today. In an airline cockpit, you've got the dual crew, and with that, you've got the idea that they have redundancy in their procedures, and so pretty much everything was caught and nothing bad happened. So let's take a look at how we can do that as a general aviation pilot. So the thing that most of us are familiar with is what's called a read-do checklist. That's the kind of standard thing you would do in any kind of normal flight training. And just as an example, it would be the kind of thing where we would really just read the checklist off. So say, for example, that we're in climb, we would check and say, okay, is my speed between 75 and 85 knots? My power is set, and I would check that. I'd look here on the checklist, my mixture is set, instruments, and so on. So we will go right down the checklist and kind of watch and see what's going on. Of course, the problem with that is that our head is up and down a whole bunch as we're reading and doing. And I bet a lot of you will probably have had the experience as well, that if you get distracted or maybe your finger moves, or if you're not even holding your finger on it, you can accidentally miss an item. So there's a great technique that you can use that simulates having that dual crew environment, and it's called a flow, or a do verify is a more official name for it. So let's check out how we would do that. For a flow, what we would do is we would want to make a pattern in our airplane, and we wouldn't figure this out for every type of procedure we would want to do. The nice thing is that we're sitting here in a Cessna 172N model, and it's got a really simple flow that works for pretty much any kind of operation that you're going to do and covers just about all of them. So I'll just show you that really quick. So what I would do is I would think to myself, what am I doing? So let's say it's my before landing flow. So I'm always going to follow the same pattern, and what I'm going to do is just pause at each item as I go while I'm flying, of course, watching outside for traffic. And I'll think to myself, do I want that on or off for landing, or where do I want that set? So for example, I would always start down here at the fuel selector gauge, and I'd want to put that where I want it. So maybe I had moved that left or right during cruise, so I put it back to both for before landing. I check my trim and make sure it's set where I want it. I would come over here and just check the flaps to make sure that the flaps were set where I wanted them. Mixture, perhaps I leaned it during cruise, and so I want to start enriching that or go full rich depending on my altitude. Of course, adjust my throttle, check carb heat. So each item, notice I'm just touching them, I'm just thinking to myself, where would I want that? In the case of before landing, unless I've already reduced power, I just want that to be off. Just a quick look at the circuit breakers, check my mags where I'd want them to be, maybe check the primer in and locked. I'd come up and just check my switches. Maybe it's time to turn on the landing light is what I would choose there. And then I'd come up and cross and just verify my instruments are all good to go. Check my engine instruments, make sure everything's good there, and then come over to my avionics and set them where I would want them. This would be the kind of flow I would do before I even got into the pattern and have all of this type of stuff set. Once I've done that flow, then I go ahead and grab the checklist and I'd say, oh, where's my before landing, pre-landing in this case? And so I would say, oh, you know what? I forgot the brake test. So I'm going to go ahead and check the brakes while I'm in flight. Landing light, I'd verify, yep, I did do that. That was on. Autopilot, not installed in this airplane, so no worries there. Seatbelt, forgot that. So I would check that and just make sure that those are secure. Mixture, already set it for best power. Carb heat, and in this case, it would depend on the situation. If I'm already reducing power and ready to start my approach, I'd have that on. Fuel selector, I did put on both, and flaps as required. So you'll notice that I do my flow. I'm going to remember, I guarantee you, if you get this down, probably 90% of the things almost every time, if not more, you'll catch all those things. And then you use this to double check, make sure I did it, and you'll catch those things that you missed the first time around. So it's a really great technique. And basically what you're doing is you're simulating having that other crew member with you. And in fact, I know that even when I fly by myself, I literally talk out loud and I will say, before landing flow, I do my flow. Before landing flow is complete, then I grab my checklist. Before landing checklist, and then I read off my checklist and say, before landing checklist complete. So there are two exceptions that you want to think about when using a flow, and maybe when you wouldn't want to use a flow. So the first exception that you want to think about when maybe you won't want to use a flow is abnormal procedures. Those would be things that you don't really do very often and that aren't time critical in terms of I've got to get things done right now, but you have time to refer to the checklist and do it. So if maybe things like a manual gear extension if you've got a retractable gear aircraft, or even like a low voltage indication where it's not like an immediate emergency in terms of a fire, but we can just turn the power off, and then just follow the checklist procedure instead. So the second exception to the rule of using a flow would be things like emergency items where time is critical. And in that case, what you might do is you might have kind of a hybrid. You'll have certain items that you will do as a flow, things that you've memorized, and then you'll back it up with a checklist. And then other things, other parts of it might be things where you just do and verify. So for example, I like to use an acronym for my engine out. So if I have an engine out in flight, I use the ABCD, and I use ABCDC at the end of it. A being for get my best airspeed, B, my best field to figure out where I'm going, C for do the checklist, and I use that as a flow, and then I back it up with a checklist, then D, declare the emergency, and I use that other C as the second checklist, which is your pre-off-field landing checklist or forced landing checklist. So again, just use some good common sense there and figure out what parts should you have memorized and that you'll do as a flow, and then what parts will you use on that checklist in that instance where you'll know just go to the checklist and use that as my guide in that kind of stressful situation. Couple of safety tips to think about. The first thing is, if able, post important checklists on the airplane where applicable. And in fact, you could even see right here, we've got V speeds posted on this airplane. So there may be certain things for your airplane that you want to have posted to the dash somewhere or somewhere in the airplane to make it very easy for you to find that. And then the second thing is, make sure you use the practice of touch and verify. So you'll notice that when I did my flow earlier, I touched every item because it's a way for me to kind of slow down and think, what do I want to do with that? The other thing I want to say is, it's really easy when things get busy, like when you're coming in and you're coming into the pattern, you're getting ready to land, to kind of feel that crunch of time and start to think, I've got to get this done. Really fight that temptation. What you'll want to do instead is take your time, pause on that item, and really think to yourself. And really when you do it, it doesn't really take all that long, but pause and think, where do I want that? That's the mixture control, I want that full rich. That's the throttle, I want that set at this. That's the carb beat, I want to do this. So really pause, touch it, and think, what am I doing? Because what can happen is you can very quickly just kind of do a sort of a wave your hand over and forget things. So really important as a good safety tip. And then the last thing is to make sure that if you do get interrupted somehow, you may need to restart your flow and do it again. And then always, as always, back it up with that checklist. So I hope you find this useful today. We're talking about flows and a way that you can design them for your own airplane. And it doesn't always have to follow the same pattern even. You can come up with a pattern that works for your airplane. But as always, make sure it matches up with your checklist, even though you may do some of the items out of order. But if you do that, you'll know that you're getting those important items and then you're using that checklist. And I think you'll find that it might be helpful to make you a little more like an airline crew as a single pilot.